Welcome to the channel The Revenge of Slaves. Welcome to the new story of slavery. Catherine Marlowe stood on the veranda of Oakage Plantation, using a fan to cool herself against the heavy August heat when she first spotted him. A wagon made its way up the lengthy dirt road, stirring clouds of dust that floated in the stagnant air like a suspended veil. Her husband, Richard Marlowe, was seated next to the driver, waving his hands excitedly, as he always did whenever he believed he had secured a worthwhile bargain. However, it was the shackled individual in the wagon's bed that made Catherine's breath stop. He was massive. Even while seated, bent forward with his wrists chained to the floor of the wagon, he loomed over the two guards positioned on each side. The width of his shoulders appeared to obscure the sunlight behind him. His hands, despite being restrained, seemed capable of crushing a man's skull with little effort. Yet, there was a peculiar quality about him that Catherine could not define. He kept his gaze lowered, his body language submissive, almost broken. A periodic cough escaped him, a moist, rasping noise that indicated sickness. His clothing hung loosely on his physique, as if he had recently lost a significant amount of weight. "Catherine!" Richard called out as the wagon halted. "Come observe what I have purchased. Just wait until you witness the size of this one. He will perform the labor of 3 men. Catherine descended the stairs slowly, her silk dress rustling and her grip tight on the railing. Over the years, she had witnessed many enslaved individuals arrive at Oakage. The plantation currently held 43 people, but none had ever resembled this man. As she drew closer, the giant raised his head slightly, just enough for her to glimpse his eyes. They were deep, perceptive, and for a fleeting instant, she noticed something cross them, an expression that seemed almost like assessment before he dropped his gaze again and coughed into his shackled hands. "He is unwell," Catherine observed, instinctively stepping backward. "Richard, you did not spend full price on an ailing slave, did you?" Richard chuckled, the noise echoing across the yard. "Just a minor issue, nothing serious. The seller promised it's only exhaustion from the journey. A few days of rest and proper meals, and he will be as powerful as an ox. Observe his size, Catherine. Those arms, those shoulders. I secured him for half the usual cost because of that cough. It's the best deal of the season." Catherine remained unconvinced. Something about the giant disturbed her, even if she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, that unusual mix of evident feebleness and concealed power. Or maybe it was something in his eyes during the short moment he had looked at her, a depth that hinted at more awareness than was comfortable. "What is his name?" she asked. "He calls himself Jonas," Richard replied, motioning for the guards to release the captive's chains. "Claims he was a field worker on a South Carolina estate before his owner died and the assets were sold off. A strong laborer, no history of fleeing or defiance, an ideal addition to our workforce." As the chains were removed, Jonas rose slowly, and Catherine had to angle her head back to see his face. He must have stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a physique suggesting enormous power despite the evident sickness. He wobbled slightly, as if disoriented, and steadied himself against the wagon. One of the guards laughed. "Be careful, big man. You wouldn't want to fall and injure yourself before you've done any work." Jonas remained silent, merely nodding in submission as he was guided toward the enslaved people's quarters. Catherine watched him leave, that uneasy sensation lingering in her chest like a heavy pebble. She had been raised on a plantation, had spent all 28 years of her life within the system, and had developed certain intuitions about the people her husband owned. Something about Jonas felt incorrect. Not exactly dangerous, he appeared too feeble, too submissive to be a threat, but wrong nonetheless. "You worry excessively," Richard said, placing an arm around her shoulders. "He's just a large, uncomplicated field hand. Nothing to concern yourself with." Now shall we head inside? I am starving, and I am certain Bessie has prepared a delicious dinner. Catherine allowed herself to be guided indoors, but she glanced back once at the figure of Jonas disappearing into the quarters. She could not shake the feeling that her husband had introduced something onto their plantation that would alter everything. She simply did not yet know if that change would be for good or ill. What Catherine did not know, what no one at Oakage Plantation knew, was that Jonas was not his true name. He had not been a field worker in South Carolina, had never been submissive or simple or weak, and the cough, the bent posture, the appearance of illness were all meticulously fabricated lies designed to achieve one specific goal: infiltration. His real name was Elijah. He was 32 years old, and he was a hunter. Before we proceed with this narrative, please remember to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you are listening from. Thank you, and let us continue. 6 months earlier, February 1857, Tennessee. Elijah had been born free in a small community of free black individuals in the mountains of Tennessee. His father, Samuel, was a legendary tracker and hunter who had escaped slavery 20 years before Elijah's birth and had never been recaptured. Samuel had taught his son everything he knew about following game, interpreting signs in the wilderness, understanding animal behavior, moving silently through forests, and most crucially, how to think like a predator. A hunter does not run after his prey, Samuel had told him when he was young. A hunter comprehends his prey. He studies its routines, its vulnerabilities, its anxieties, and then he constructs a trap so flawless that the prey steps into it willingly. Elijah had grown into one of the finest hunters in the region, supplying meat for his community, and occasionally guiding affluent white men on hunting trips, men who paid generously and asked no questions about his status because his abilities were too indispensable. He had a wife, a small cabin, and a life that, while not easy in a nation that despised his skin color, even when he was technically free, was at least his own. Then, 3 years ago, everything had shifted. His mother, Ruth, had been born into enslavement on a Georgia plantation called Oakage. She had escaped when Elijah was only an infant, traveling hundreds of miles north with him wrapped in a blanket against her chest, following the North Star and the whispered directions of the Underground Railroad. She had found Samuel, had constructed a life, had experienced freedom. But 20 years later, slave catchers had located her. They had arrived at night with hounds, chains, and a legal document declaring her the property of Richard Marlowe of Oakage Plantation, Georgia. The law did not care that she had lived freely for 2 decades. It did not care that she had a husband and a grown son. It did not care that forcing her back into bondage was a cruelty that violated every standard of human decency. The Fugitive Slave Act was explicit. Escaped enslaved people could be captured and returned to their owners, regardless of how long they had been free or where they were found. Elijah had been away on a hunting trip when it happened. By the time he returned, his mother was gone. His father had tried to intervene, and had been beaten so severely he could no longer walk. The cabin had been looted, and pinned to the door was a notice: property of Richard Marlowe, Oakage Plantation, Georgia, legally reclaimed. Elijah had held his father, while the old man wept. Samuel, who had escaped bondage, built a life, and taught his son to be strong and free, had been powerless to protect the woman he loved. "I am sorry," Samuel kept repeating. "I am sorry. I could not stop them. There were too many. I could not stop them. It is not your fault," Elijah had told him. But inside, a cold rage was building. His mother was back in chains because of a man named Richard Marlowe. Back on a plantation called Oakage, back in a world of violence, degradation, and stolen humanity. And Elijah was going to retrieve her. But he was not reckless. He understood that he could not simply walk onto a plantation and demand his mother's release. A direct assault would result in his death or his own enslavement. So he did what his father had taught him. He studied his prey. He learned everything possible about Oakage Plantation, about Richard Marlowe, about the property's layout, the number of overseers, and the security measures in place. What he discovered was intimidating. Oakage was one of the largest plantations in Georgia, with over 400 acres of cotton and tobacco fields. Richard Marlowe was wealthy, well-connected, and infamous for his harsh treatment of enslaved people. The plantation employed 6 overseers, all armed and experienced. There were dogs, patrols, and a reputation for brutally punishing any enslaved person who attempted escape. A direct rescue was impossible. But infiltration, that might work. So Elijah devised a plan that was audacious to the point of insanity. He would get himself sold to Richard Marlowe. He would enter Oakage Plantation not as a rescuer, but as property. Once inside, he would collect information, locate his mother, and execute an escape that would liberate not only her, but as many others as possible. In the process, he would dismantle Richard Marlowe's operation so completely that the man would never recover. It took 6 months of preparation. Elijah had to learn to behave like an enslaved person, to adopt the posture, the speech patterns, the submissive conduct that white people expected. He had to suppress every instinct that made him free and strong. He had to become, at least externally, the kind of property that would be bought and sold. The hardest part was allowing himself to be captured. He traveled south to the borders of slave territory and deliberately let a slave patrol find him. He claimed to be a runaway from a South Carolina plantation, gave false information about his owner, and acted confused, frightened, and weak. The patrol believed him because he gave them what they expected to see: a large, simple black man who had made a foolish attempt at freedom and was now resigned to his fate. He was taken to a slave jail in Augusta, where he spent 2 weeks in chains, continuing his performance. He developed a convincing cough by inhaling dust and irritating his throat. He hunched his shoulders and moved slowly, as if exhausted. He spoke in the deferential tones that white people expected, always avoiding eye contact, always acting as if he had been beaten into submission. When the traders began preparing for the next auction, Elijah ensured he was placed in the category of questionable health, valuable for his size, but risky due to the apparent illness. He knew that Richard Marlowe was known to attend these auctions seeking bargains. Enslaved people he could buy cheaply because of some minor defect and then work to death in his fields. Sure enough, on auction day, Richard Marlowe was present. And when Elijah was brought onto the auction block, hunched, coughing, with his massive frame concealed beneath a posture of weakness, Marlowe's eyes gleamed with greed. Here was an enslaved man who appeared capable of tremendous labor, available at a discount due to a temporary illness. The bidding was brief. Most buyers were skeptical of the cough, worried about disease. But Marlowe was confident, and when the auction ended, Elijah had a new owner. He had successfully infiltrated Oakage Plantation. Now came the difficult part. The first week at Oakage was designed to break him, to test whether he was worth the investment Richard Marlowe had made. Elijah was assigned to the cotton fields, the most brutal work on the plantation, where men and women labored from dawn until well past dusk under the supervision of overseers who carried whips and used them freely. The head overseer was a man named Garrett Pike, a veteran of plantation management who had worked at Oakage for 15 years. Pike was shorter than Elijah by a foot, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who held absolute power over other human beings. On Elijah's first morning, Pike looked him up and down with undisguised contempt.
"So, you are the giant the master bought,"
Pike said, circling Elijah like a predator examining prey.
"Big man with a cough." Let us see if you can actually work, or if the master wasted his money.
Elijah kept his head down and said nothing, maintaining the submissive posture he had perfected. Pike smiled, a cruel expression that did not reach his eyes.
You will be in the west field starting today. You will pick cotton from sunrise to sunset. You will fill your basket to the top, just like everyone else. If you fall behind, you will be encouraged to work faster. If you slack off, you will be reminded of your place. If you cause any trouble, you will learn why runaways from Oakage are so rare. Do you understand?
Yes, sir, Elijah said quietly, injecting just the right amount of fear into his voice.
Good. Now get to work.
The west field stretched for acres, row after row of cotton plants heavy with bolls that needed to be picked. 40 enslaved people worked the field, their fingers moving with practiced efficiency as they plucked cotton and dropped it into the large baskets strapped to their backs. An overseer patrolled the rows on horseback, a whip coiled at his belt, watching for any sign of slacking. Elijah took his position at the end of a row and began picking. His massive hands, which could track a deer through miles of forest and set traps that even the craftiest predators could not avoid, now performed the mindless, repetitive task of pulling cotton from plants. He worked slowly at first, maintaining the appearance of weakness, coughing periodically to remind everyone of his supposed illness. But he was also observing, watching the overseer's patrol patterns, counting how many guards were visible at any given time, noting which enslaved people seemed broken and which still had fight in their eyes, learning the layout of the fields, the location of the tree line, the distance to various buildings. Every detail was stored away, pieces of a puzzle he was slowly assembling. By midday, his basket was only half full, far behind the other workers. The overseer on horseback noticed and rode over, stopping his horse inches from where Elijah stood.
You are slow, big man. Very slow. Surely a giant like you can pick faster than that.
Elijah coughed and kept his eyes down.
Sorry, sir. Still feeling weak. I will work faster.
The overseer considered this, then without warning struck Elijah across the back with his whip. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Elijah forced himself not to react beyond a small flinch. He had experienced pain before, knife wounds from hunting accidents, broken bones from falls, burns from campfires. This was nothing he could not handle. But more importantly, he could not show strength, could not reveal that he was more than he appeared.
That is to help you remember to work faster,
the overseer said.
Next time I come by, your basket had better be fuller, or you will receive more than one. Yes, sir,
Elijah whispered. The overseer rode off, and Elijah resumed picking, now moving slightly faster, but still maintaining his performance of weakness. An older woman working nearby glanced at him with sympathy.
Do not let them break you on the first day,
she said quietly.
Pace yourself. Show just enough effort that they do not kill you, but not so much that they expect it every day. Thank you,
Elijah said, and meant it. This woman, her name was Abigail, he would learn later, had been at Oakage for 20 years. She knew how to survive. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Sweat poured down Elijah's face and back. His hands, despite their size and strength, began to ache from the repetitive motion. But this was nothing compared to tracking game for days through mountain wilderness. This was nothing compared to what his mother was enduring somewhere on this plantation. That thought kept him going. Ruth was here, somewhere within these 400 acres. His mother was working, suffering, enduring. He just had to find her. By evening, when the bell finally rang to signal the end of the workday, Elijah's basket was nearly full. Not the fullest, but respectable enough that the overseers did not punish him further. The enslaved people trudged back to their quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins that housed the plantation's labor force. The cabins were cramped, poorly maintained, and offered minimal protection from the elements. But they were shelter, and after 16 hours of work, even a thin mattress on a wooden floor seemed like luxury. Elijah was assigned to a cabin with 5 other men, all field workers. They eyed him wearily as he entered, taking in his size, his apparent weakness, his status as a newcomer.
"You the new giant?"
asked one man, middle-aged with a scar across his cheek. His name was Moses.
"Yes,"
Elijah said simply.
"Did you pick much cotton today?" "Not enough." "Still sick?"
Moses nodded, accepting this.
"Get better fast. Master does not keep sick slaves long. Either you work or you get sold south to the rice plantations, and nobody survives rice country."
The other men murmured agreement. Elijah filed this information away. Another piece of the puzzle. Oakage was harsh, but apparently there were places even worse, and Marlowe was not above selling defective property to maximize his profit. That night, lying on his thin mattress while the others slept, Elijah began his real work. He had spent the day observing, learning the surface details of plantation life. But nights would be for deeper intelligence gathering, for moving silently through the darkness, avoiding detection, collecting the kind of information that would make his eventual plan possible. He waited until the cabin was silent except for snoring, then rose carefully. His size made stealth challenging, but his father had taught him how to move without sound, how to distribute his weight, how to breathe so quietly that even animals would not detect him. These skills, honed over decades of hunting, now served a different purpose. He slipped out of the cabin into the humid Georgia night. The plantation was quiet but not unguarded. Elijah could see torches in the distance, where overseers maintained patrol routes. He could hear dogs barking somewhere beyond the main house, bloodhounds, probably trained to track runaways. This would require careful navigation. He moved through the shadows between buildings, staying low, avoiding open spaces. His destination tonight was simple reconnaissance. Learn the layout of the quarters, identify which cabins housed which groups, locate the main house, the overseer residences, the storage buildings. Basic intelligence that would inform more complex operations later. As he crept past the women's quarters, he heard quiet weeping from inside one cabin. He paused, listening. A woman's voice, older, speaking in a tone that suggested she was comforting someone younger. The words were indistinct, but the emotion was clear: pain, loss, exhaustion. His mother was in one of these cabins. He did not know which one yet, did not dare risk searching tonight when he was still learning the patrol patterns. But knowing she was close made his chest tighten with emotion he could not afford to indulge. Not yet. Not until he had a plan that would actually work. He continued his circuit, noting everything. The main house was large and well lit, even at night, with at least 2 people visible through windows, house slaves probably working late. The overseer cabins were positioned strategically around the property, ensuring that no area was completely unwatched. The storage buildings, where tools and supplies were kept, were locked but not heavily guarded. And in the distance, he could see the edge of the forest that bordered the plantation, dark, dense, and offering potential escape routes if needed. After an hour of reconnaissance, Elijah returned to his cabin and slipped back onto his mattress. None of the other men had stirred. He lay there in the darkness, processing what he had learned, beginning to form the outline of a plan that would require patience, precision, and a level of deception he had never attempted before. He would need to maintain his performance of weakness for weeks, maybe months, long enough to earn a degree of trust, or at least to be dismissed as harmless. Long enough to learn more about the overseers, their personalities, their weaknesses, their habits. Long enough to make contact with his mother and assess her condition. Long enough to identify allies among the enslaved people who might be willing to risk everything for freedom. And then, When the time was right, he would stop being Jonas the weak field hand and become Elijah the hunter once more. And Richard Marlowe's plantation would learn what it meant to be prey. The next morning came too early, announced by a bell that rang across the plantation at dawn. The enslaved people rose immediately, knowing that delays resulted in punishment. They were given a brief period to eat a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush and water before being marched back to the fields. Elijah fell into the routine, continuing his performance. He picked cotton slowly but steadily, just fast enough to avoid beatings, but not so fast as to seem healthy. He coughed at regular intervals. He hunched his shoulders and moved as if every step required effort. And he watched constantly, gathering more information. On the third day, he made his first important discovery. During the midday break, when enslaved people were allowed a few minutes to drink water and rest, he noticed a woman working in the adjacent field who moved with a familiar grace despite her obvious exhaustion. She was in her 50s, with gray threading through her hair. Even from a distance, even after 3 years of separation, Elijah recognized her. Ruth, his mother. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to speak to her, to assure her that help had come. But he forced himself to remain still. Any unusual behavior would be noted by the overseers. Any connection between them would be remembered. He could not risk it. Not yet. But knowing she was there, seeing with his own eyes that she was alive, gave him renewed determination. She looked older than he remembered, thinner, with a weariness that broke his heart. But she was alive, and he was going to get her out. That evening, he learned more about the plantation's hierarchy through conversations with his cabin mates. Moses, the scarred man, was surprisingly talkative once he decided Elijah was not a threat.
Master Marlowe, he is mean but predictable,
Moses explained as they ate their evening rations.
As long as you work hard and do not cause trouble, he mostly leaves you alone. It is the mistress you have to watch out for.
The mistress? Elijah asked, remembering the pale woman who had watched him arrive.
Catherine Marlowe,
another man said, his voice dropping to a whisper.
She is worse than the master in some ways. Master beats you when you fail. Mistress beats you when she is bored. And she is always watching, always suspicious. You cannot trust her. Not for a second.
This was concerning. Elijah had been so focused on Richard Marlowe that he had not adequately considered his wife. A mistake he would need to correct.
What about the overseers?
He asked.
6 of them,
Moses said.
Pike is the worst. He has been here forever and knows every trick. Then there are Turner, Crawford, and the others. They are all armed, all mean, and they work in shifts, so there is always someone watching. And then there are the dogs. How many dogs? 5 bloodhounds. Big ones, trained to track runaways. They have caught every slave who has tried to escape in the last 10 years. Those dogs are the real reason nobody runs. You can maybe outsmart the overseers, but you cannot outsmart a bloodhound's nose.
Elijah filed this information away. 5 dogs. That was actually fewer than he had feared. And dogs, despite their reputation, were animals with predictable behaviors. He had hunted with dogs, tracked with dogs, and most importantly, he had learned how to evade dogs when necessary. They were not invincible.
Has anyone ever succeeded in escaping?
He asked casually. The cabin fell silent. Moses looked at him with something like pity.
Why are you asking? Are you thinking about running, big man? You will be dead in a week. Or worse, you will be caught and made an example of. Master Marlowe does not just whip runaways. He breaks them. Makes them wish they had never been born. And then he sells them south to places where they work you to death in 6 months. Do not even think about it. I am not.
Elijah lied.
Just curious.
But the conversation told him something important. The enslaved people at Oakage had been so thoroughly broken, so convinced of the impossibility of escape, that they would not even consider it. This meant he could not count on mass cooperation. When the time came, he would have to act with a small, trusted group, or possibly alone. Over the following weeks, Elijah settled into the brutal routine of plantation life while secretly continuing his nocturnal reconnaissance. He mapped every building, every patrol route, every dog kennel. He identified the locations where supplies were stored, where weapons were kept, where the overseers slept. He learned which guards were alert and which were lazy, which dogs were truly dangerous and which were mostly for show. And gradually, carefully, he began to make contact with enslaved people who seemed like potential allies. Not many. Trust was a luxury that enslaved people could not afford, but a few. Abigail, the older woman who had shown him kindness on his first day, a young man named Samuel, who still had fire in his eyes, a woman named Clara, who worked in the main house and had access to information about the Marlowe schedules and habits. He did not reveal his true purpose. Not yet. He simply established himself as someone who listened, who was thoughtful, who might be more than he appeared. Seeds that would grow when the time came. A month after his arrival, Elijah finally found an opportunity to speak directly with his mother. It happened during a Sunday afternoon, the one time when enslaved people were given a few hours of rest. He had learned that Ruth spent her Sundays in a small garden behind the women's quarters, tending vegetables that supplemented the plantation's food supplies. He approached carefully, making sure no overseers were watching. When he was close enough, he spoke quietly without looking directly at her. "Mama!" Ruth's hands froze over the tomato plant she had been tending. Her breath caught. Slowly, she turned to look at him, and Elijah saw recognition dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by terror. "No," she whispered. "No, you cannot be here. Elijah, what have you done?" "I came for you," he said simply. "I came to take you home." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You fool. You beautiful, stupid fool. Do you know what they will do if they find out? Do you know what they will do to both of us? They will not find out. Not until it is too late." "How?" Her voice was desperate. "How can you possibly, Elijah? There are 6 overseers, 5 dogs, patrols every night. Master Marlowe is connected to every sheriff and slave catcher in 3 counties. Even if we ran, we would be caught before we made it 10 miles. Then we do not run," Elijah said. "Not yet. Not until I have prepared everything. Mama, trust me. I am not the boy you raised. I am a hunter, and I have spent the last month learning everything about this place. When I move, it will work. I promise you." Ruth stared at him, seeing perhaps for the first time that her son had become something formidable, something dangerous. "What do you need from me?" she finally asked. "Information about the Marlowes, about the house, about anything that might be useful. And patience. This will not happen tomorrow, but it will happen." Over the next several minutes, speaking in urgent whispers, Ruth shared everything she knew. She told him about Richard Marlowe's schedule, his business trips to Savannah that happened quarterly. She told him about Catherine's habits, her tendency to ride out to the fields on horseback to inspect the work. She told him about the main house's layout, including a study where Marlowe kept his personal weapons and papers. Most importantly, she told him about the one night each year when the plantation's guard was at its lowest, the harvest celebration. It was a tradition at Oakage that when the cotton harvest was complete, Richard Marlowe hosted a large party for neighboring plantation owners. The event required all the house slaves to work in the main house, and the overseers were often drunk by midnight, celebrating with the white guests. It was the only time when security was truly lax. "When is the harvest celebration this year?" Elijah asked. 6 weeks.
Early October. Perfect.
Elijah felt pieces of his plan clicking into place.
That is when we move.
Ruth asked.
We cannot free everyone. Even if we could escape ourselves, trying to take 40 other people.
Not 40, Elijah interrupted.
But not just 2 either. I have been watching, Mama. There are people here who deserve freedom, who would fight for it if they believed it was possible. We are going to give them that chance.
Ruth looked at her son, this man who had infiltrated a plantation, who had spent weeks playing weak while gathering intelligence, who spoke with a quiet confidence that came from genuine capability rather than bravado. And she felt something she had not felt in 3 years, hope.
Tell me your plan,
she said. And for the next 20 minutes, while pretending to work in the garden, Elijah outlined exactly how he intended to dismantle Richard Marlowe's operation and free not just his mother, but as many enslaved people as were willing to risk everything for liberation. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It relied on perfect timing and flawless execution. But it could work. And that night, as Elijah lay in his cabin pretending to sleep, he allowed himself a small smile. The trap was set. The prey had no idea what was coming. And in 6 weeks, Oakage Plantation would learn what happened when you enslaved a hunter's mother. The giant they thought they had bought was not weak, was not simple, was not broken. He was the most dangerous man they would ever encounter. And their time was running out. The 6 weeks between Elijah's conversation with his mother and the harvest celebration passed with agonizing slowness, each day a carefully choreographed performance of submission while he refined every detail of his plan. The work in the cotton fields continued its brutal rhythm, dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons offering any respite. But Elijah used every moment strategically, turning his enslavement into an extended reconnaissance mission. His illness began to show signs of improvement, but slowly, gradually, in a way that seemed natural. He coughed less frequently. His posture straightened slightly. His cotton picking increased from half a basket per day to 3/4, then to a full basket. The overseers noticed and were pleased. Their investment was paying off. Richard Marlowe himself commented during one of his infrequent visits to the fields that the giant was finally earning his keep. Catherine Marlowe, however, remained suspicious. Elijah noticed her watching him more than the other enslaved people. Her eyes narrowed as if trying to solve a puzzle she could not quite articulate. She would ride out to the fields on her chestnut mare, ostensibly to inspect the work, but Elijah could feel her gaze lingering on him longer than necessary. It was unsettling, this attention, but he never acknowledged it. Never gave her any reason to think he was anything other than what he appeared to be. During the 4th week of his preparation, Catherine approached him directly. It was midday, the sun blazing overhead, and Elijah was drinking water from the communal bucket when her horse stopped beside him. He immediately lowered his eyes. The gesture of deference, so practiced now, it was almost natural.
You?
She said, her voice sharp.
Jonas, is it not? Yes, ma'am.
Elijah replied quietly, not looking up.
You have been here a month now. You are working better. Stronger. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Look at me when I speak to you.
Elijah raised his eyes slowly, making sure his expression showed nothing but respectful attention. Catherine studied his face for a long moment, her own expression unreadable.
There is something about you,
she said finally.
Something I cannot quite identify. You are different from the others. Smarter, perhaps. More aware.
Every instinct screamed at Elijah to deny this, to deflect, to return to his performance a simple-minded obedience. But Catherine was perceptive in a way her husband was not, and complete denial might seem suspicious in itself. So he chose a middle path.
Just trying to work hard, ma'am. Trying to be useful. Do not want to be sold south.
Catherine's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile.
Sold south. Yes, that is every slave's nightmare, is it not? The rice plantations, the sugar fields, places where Negroes die faster than they can be replaced.
She paused, watching his reaction.
Are you afraid of that, Jonas? Yes, ma'am,
Elijah said honestly, because that much was true. He had heard the stories of those plantations, where enslaved people were literally worked to death within months. It was a fate he would not wish on anyone.
Good. Fear keeps you obedient. Fear keeps you alive.
Catherine turned her horse to leave, then stopped.
My husband thinks he got a bargain when he bought you. A strong worker at half price because of a temporary illness. But I wonder if perhaps you are more trouble than you are worth.
She rode away without waiting for a response, leaving Elijah standing there with his heart pounding. This was dangerous. Catherine's suspicion, even if she could not articulate exactly what she suspected, was a threat to everything he had planned. He would need to be even more careful around her. That evening, he shared his concern with Ruth during one of their carefully arranged brief encounters. They had developed a system where they could exchange a few words during Sunday afternoons without attracting attention, and occasionally, when Ruth was assigned to work in the vegetable garden, Elijah could engineer reasons to be nearby.
Catherine has always been like that,
Ruth said quietly, her hands moving mechanically as she pulled weeds.
She watches everyone, looking for signs of resistance, of intelligence, of anything that might threaten their control. But she cannot do anything based on suspicion alone. Just keep being what they expect to see. What if she convinces Marlowe to sell me before the harvest celebration? She will not. Richard is too pleased with your cotton production. As long as you keep working hard, he will not get rid of you. Catherine may suspect something, but she has no proof, and Richard does not listen to her hunches.
Elijah nodded, filing this information away. It highlighted something he had already observed. The marriage between Richard and Catherine Marlowe was not one of equals. Catherine was intelligent and perceptive, but in the world they inhabited, her opinions mattered less than her husband's financial calculations. As long as Elijah was profitable, he was safe. During the 5th week, Elijah began the most dangerous phase of his preparation, recruiting allies. He had identified 5 enslaved people who seemed like potential collaborators, people who still had fight in them, who were not completely broken by the system. The challenge was approaching them without revealing too much, without creating a conspiracy so large that someone might betray it out of fear or hope of reward. His first recruit was Abigail, the older woman who had shown him kindness on his first day. She was 57 years old, had been enslaved at Oakage for 22 years, and had a quiet strength that came from surviving unspeakable hardships. Elijah approached her one Sunday afternoon, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper.
Abigail, can I ask you something? If you had a chance, a real chance to be free, would you take it, even if it meant risking your life?
Abigail's hand stilled over the quilt she was mending. She did not look at him, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady.
Every slave dreams of freedom, Jonas, but dreams do not mean anything when the reality is dogs and whips and slave catchers. Why are you asking? Because dreams can become reality if you plan carefully enough. If you are willing to be patient. If you are willing to fight when the moment comes.
Now Abigail did look at him, her eyes searching his face.
Who are you really? You are not what you pretend to be, are you? I am someone who keeps promises,
Elijah said.
And I promised myself I would free my mother from this place. But I cannot do it alone. I need people I can trust. People who are willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Your mother,
Abigail repeated slowly.
Ruth, the woman in the vegetable garden. I should have seen it. You have her eyes. Will you help?
Abigail was silent for a long moment, weighing the risk against the possibility.
Finally, she nodded. What do you need me to do? Over the next 2 weeks, Elijah carefully recruited 4 more allies. Samuel, a 23-year-old field hand who had seen his wife sold away the previous year and burned with quiet rage. Clara, who worked in the main house and had access to information about the Marlowe's routines. Moses, the scarred man from Elijah's cabin who had lived at Oakage long enough to know every detail of its operation. And a woman named Hannah, who worked in the kitchen and could provide access to certain supplies when needed. To each of them, Elijah revealed only what they needed to know. He told them that during the harvest celebration, when security would be at its weakest, they would make their move. He told them that he had a plan that would give them a genuine chance at freedom. He told them that it would be dangerous, that some of them might not survive, but that the alternative was remaining enslaved for the rest of their lives. All of them agreed to help, because even the smallest possibility of freedom was better than the certainty of bondage. The harvest celebration was scheduled for the first Saturday in October. As the date approached, Elijah could feel the tension building in his chest, a combination of anticipation and fear that he worked hard to conceal. Everything he had planned for the past 2 months would come down to a single night. If it worked, they would be free. If it failed, they would all die horribly. 3 days before the celebration, Richard Marlowe called all the enslaved people together in the yard for an announcement. It was unusual for him to address them directly. He typically left such communications to the overseers, but apparently this warranted his personal attention. The harvest is complete, Marlowe announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Thanks to your hard work. He said this as if they had any choice in the matter. We have had our best cotton yield in 5 years. This Saturday, I will be hosting plantation owners from across the county to celebrate our success. All house slaves will be working in the main house to serve our guests. The rest of you will remain in your quarters and will not, under any circumstances, venture near the main house. Is that understood? A murmured chorus of, "Yes, master," rippled through the crowd. Good. And just to ensure everyone remains where they belong, the overseers will be conducting periodic checks of the quarters throughout the evening. Anyone found where they should not be will be dealt with severely. Elijah listened to this pronouncement with a sinking feeling. Periodic checks of the quarters would complicate his plan significantly. He had been counting on the overseers being distracted by the party, drinking with the guests, their attention focused on the main house rather than the slave quarters. This new security measure was a problem. That evening, he gathered his small group of allies behind the storage barn, where they could speak without being overheard. We have a problem, he told them, explaining about the planned checks of the quarters. If the overseers are patrolling regularly, it is going to be much harder to move without being detected. So what do we do? Samuel asked, his voice tight with tension. Call it off? No, Elijah said firmly. We adapt. This actually might work in our favor if we are smart about it. Think about it. If the overseers are checking the quarters, that means they are moving around, not stationary. They are predictable, and predictable patterns can be exploited. How? Clara asked. Elijah thought for a moment, his mind working through the logistics. How many overseers total? 6, Moses answered. Pike, Turner, Crawford, Bennett, Hayes, and the new one, Dalton. And how many will be needed at the main house to supervise the house slaves and keep order among the drunk guests? Clara, who worked in the house and understood its operations, considered this. At least 3, maybe 4. Master Marlowe will not want any trouble in front of his guests. He will want his best overseers there to make sure everything runs smoothly. So that leaves 2, maybe 3 overseers to patrol the quarters, Elijah said, checking on 43 slaves spread across a dozen cabins. That is a lot of ground to cover. They will have to move in a pattern, a route that lets them check each cabin efficiently. and patterns can be timed.
Understanding began to dawn on the others' faces. Moses nodded slowly.
If we can figure out their route, we can stay one step ahead of them, move when they are checking the far cabins, be back in place before they circle around.
Exactly, Elijah said.
But we need to know their pattern, which means we need someone on the inside who can observe and report. I can do that,
Anna said. She was a quiet woman in her 40s, easily overlooked, which made her perfect for observation.
I will be working in the kitchen during the party. I can watch when the overseers come and go, track their timing, and pass information to Clara. And I can give messages to whoever needs them,
Clara added.
I will be serving in the dining room, moving between the main house and the kitchen. I can act as a courier.
Elijah felt the plan coming together, adapting to the new constraints.
Good. Here is what we do. Hannah tracks the overseer patrol pattern during the first hour of the party and gets the information to Clara. Clara passes it to Moses, who will be in the quarters coordinating timing. Once we know the pattern, we move during the gaps, when the overseers are farthest from their next checkpoint. Move where?
Abigail asked.
What exactly are we doing?
This was the moment when Elijah had to reveal the full scope of his plan. He took a deep breath and began to speak, laying out every detail of what he intended to do.
First, we need to neutralize the dogs. The bloodhounds are kept in a kennel near the overseer cabins. They are the biggest threat to any escape because they can track us for miles. But dogs are predictable. They eat at the same time every day, fed by whoever is on dog duty. During the party, that will probably be one of the younger overseers, someone not important enough to be at the main house. How do we neutralize them?
Samuel asked.
We make them sleep, Elijah said. Hannah, you have access to the kitchen supplies, right? Including the medicinal cabinet.
Hannah nodded.
Yes. Mrs. Marlowe keeps laudanum there for her headaches. It is a strong sedative. Perfect. We mix laudanum into the dog's evening meal. Not enough to kill them. I will not hurt animals who are just following their training, but enough to make them sleep deeply for several hours. Once the dogs are down, the biggest obstacle to our escape is gone. But we still have to deal with the overseers,
Moses pointed out.
Even if we can dodge their patrols, eventually they will notice we are gone. And then they will send riders, alert the sheriffs, organize a manhunt. Which is why we cannot just run,
Elijah said.
We need to make sure they cannot pursue us effectively. That means we need to disable their ability to chase us.
He outlined the next phase.
While the party is in full swing and the overseers are either drunk at the main house or distracted by their patrol duties, Elijah and Samuel will make their way to the stables. There, they will release all the horses, not steal them, which would be noticed immediately, but simply open the gates and drive them into the fields, where they will scatter. Without horses, any pursuit will be on foot, giving the fugitives a significant head start. But the real key,
Elijah continued,
is destroying their records. Richard Marlowe keeps detailed documentation of every slave he owns, names, physical descriptions, ages, skills, everything a slave catcher would need to identify and pursue us. Those records are in his study, in a locked cabinet. Clara, you said you know where he keeps the key?
Clara nodded.
He keeps it on a chain around his neck. He never takes it off.
Elijah smiled grimly.
Then we will need to get it from him. Which brings me to the most dangerous part of the plan. While Marlowe is drunk and distracted by his guests, I am going to get into his study, retrieve those records, and destroy them. Without documentation, we become much harder to pursue. Slave catchers will not know exactly who they are looking for, will not have detailed descriptions to work with. That is insane,
Moses said flatly.
You are talking about walking into the main house during a party full of white people, stealing from the master while he is still awake, and walking back out. You will be caught before you make it 10 feet. Not if I am supposed to be there,
Elijah countered.
not if I am part of the serving staff for the evening.
He explained his reasoning. Richard Marlowe had bragged repeatedly about his giant slave, the massive field hand he had bought for half price, who was now one of his most productive workers. It would be entirely in character for Marlowe to show off his prize to his guests, to have the giant serve drinks or move furniture as a demonstration of his excellent slave management. All Elijah needed to do was position himself in the right place at the right time. And Catherine, who managed the house slaves, might very well assign him to work the party.
And if she does not?
Abigail asked.
Then I make sure she does. I will volunteer. Act like I am trying to be helpful to earn favor.
She will be suspicious.
She is always suspicious. But she will also be too busy managing a party for 40 guests to turn down free labor.
The plan was audacious, filled with variables that could go wrong, but it was also the best chance they had. Over the next 2 days, they refined the details, assigned roles, identified fallback positions if things went wrong. Elijah drilled them on timing, on what to do if they were separated, on how to recognize the safe houses and Underground Railroad markers they might encounter once they made it past the immediate danger zone. And finally, Saturday arrived. The morning of the harvest celebration was chaotic. The main house was a hive of activity, as house slaves prepared for the evening's festivities. Tables were set, food was prepared, the best china and silver were polished until they gleamed. In the fields, the remaining enslaved people worked a half-day, finishing the final tasks before being dismissed to their quarters for the duration of the party. Elijah worked mechanically, his mind focused on the evening ahead. Everything depended on precise timing, on a dozen small things going right, on luck and skill combining in the perfect measure. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, he felt the weight of what he was about to attempt settling on his shoulders. At 4 p.m., the enslaved people were dismissed to their quarters. At 5 p.m., the guests began to arrive, plantation owners and their wives arriving in fine carriages, dressed in expensive clothes, ready to celebrate another successful harvest built on the backs of enslaved labor. By 6 p.m., the party was in full swing, and Elijah made his move. He approached the main house through the kitchen entrance, where Hannah was working frantically to keep up with the demands of feeding 40 guests. She saw him and nodded almost imperceptibly, the signal that she had already dosed the dog's evening meal with laudanum. Phase 1 was underway.
"What are you doing here?"
demanded the cook, a free black woman named Bessie who oversaw the kitchen.
"You are supposed to be in the quarters." "I know, ma'am,"
Elijah said respectfully.
"But I heard the mistress might need extra hands for the party, and I wanted to offer my help. I can carry heavy things, move furniture, whatever is needed."
Bessie looked skeptical, but at that moment, Catherine Marlowe swept into the kitchen, her face flushed with stress.
"Bessie, we need more chairs brought in from the storage room, and the heavy ones are too much for the house boys. Do we have anyone?"
She stopped when she saw Elijah. Her eyes narrowed.
"What are you doing here, Jonas?" "Volunteering to help, ma'am. I am strong. I can move whatever needs moving."
Catherine studied him for a long moment, and Elijah could see the suspicion in her eyes, the same feeling that had made her watch him more closely than the other enslaved people. But she was also practical, and the party was demanding more labor than she had available.
"Fine,"
she said finally.
"You will work under Clara's supervision. You do exactly what you are told. Nothing more, nothing less. If I catch you anywhere you are not supposed to be, you will regret it. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you, ma'am."
And just like that, Elijah was inside the main house with legitimate reason to be there. He caught Clara's eye across the room, and she gave him the smallest nod. They were in. For the first 2 hours, Elijah played his role perfectly. He moved furniture, carried serving platters, refilled wine bottles, and generally made himself useful while staying as invisible as possible. He observed everything, the layout of the house, which he had heard described but never seen firsthand, the locations of exits and hiding places, and most importantly, Richard Marlowe's behavior. The master was drinking heavily, becoming progressively louder and more boisterous as the evening wore on. He bragged about his cotton yield, about his management techniques, about his success as a plantation owner. Several times he gestured at the house slaves serving the party, referring to them as examples of well-trained property. When he spotted Elijah carrying a heavy table across the room, his eyes lit up.
"There! You see that giant? Bought him for half price because the fool had a cough. But look at him now, strong as an ox, works like 3 men. That is the difference between a smart plantation owner and an amateur, knowing when you are getting value even in damaged goods."
The guests laughed and applauded, and Elijah kept his face carefully neutral, playing the role of the obedient slave who did not understand he was being discussed. But inside, he marked the moment, marked the casual dehumanization, the way Marlowe spoke about him, as if he were livestock, and added it to the long list of reasons why what he was about to do was not just justified but necessary. By 9 p.m., Richard Marlowe was thoroughly drunk. So were most of his guests. The overseers who had been assigned to the party, Pike, Turner, and Crawford, were drinking as well, their vigilance deteriorating with every glass of whiskey. And outside, according to the information Clara had passed him, the patrol pattern of the overseers checking the quarters had become predictable. They were doing cursory checks every 30 minutes, spending most of their time chatting with each other rather than actually searching. It was time. Elijah caught Clara's eye and nodded toward the hallway that led to Marlowe's study. She understood immediately and created a distraction, dropping a tray of glasses that shattered spectacularly on the floor, drawing everyone's attention. In the commotion, Elijah slipped down the hallway unseen. Marlowe's study was locked, but the door was old and the lock was simple. Elijah had prepared for this, had hidden a thin piece of metal in his boot that morning. He worked it into the lock, feeling for the mechanism, and within 30 seconds heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. He eased the door open, stepped inside, and closed it behind him. The study was exactly as Ruth had described: a large desk, bookshelves lining the walls, and in the corner, a locked cabinet where Marlowe kept his important papers and personal weapons. The cabinet was more secure than the door had been, and Elijah knew he could not pick this lock, not without tools he did not have and time he could not spare, which meant he needed the key that hung on a chain around Richard Marlowe's neck. Elijah stood in the darkness of the study, considering his options. He could search for another way into the cabinet, but that would take time and might not succeed. He could abandon this part of the plan, but without destroying those records, their escape would be significantly more dangerous. Or he could do something audacious, something that would either work perfectly or get him killed. He chose audacity. Elijah left the study, slipped back down the hallway, and returned to the party. Richard Marlowe was now so drunk he was slurring his words, holding onto the table for balance. Perfect. Elijah approached with a wine bottle, playing the attentive servant.
"More wine, master?"
he asked quietly. Marlowe waved his glass in what might have been a nod. As Elijah poured, he stumbled, just slightly, just enough to jostle Marlowe's arm and spill wine down the front of his expensive jacket.
"You clumsy fool!"
Marlowe roared, suddenly furious despite his inebriation. Several guests turned to look.
"Look what you have done! This jacket costs more than you are worth. I am so sorry, master,"
Elijah said, genuine fear in his voice, or what sounded like genuine fear.
"Please let me help clean it. If we get water on it quickly, It might not stain.
Still cursing, Marlowe allowed himself to be led from the room by Elijah and Clara, who had materialized at exactly the right moment. They took him to a small washroom off the kitchen, where Clara began dabbing at the wine stain with a wet cloth while Marlowe continued his drunken tirade.
Stupid, worthless. I should sell you south, rice plantations, teach you to be careful.
While Clara worked on the jacket, Elijah positioned himself behind Marlowe, ostensibly to help remove the garment. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy, and in the confusion of cloth and arms and Marlowe's drunken swaying, those hands found the chain around Marlowe's neck. A quick pull, a snap of cheap metal, and the chain came free. Elijah palmed the key and slipped it into his pocket in one smooth motion.
There, master,
Clara said, stepping back.
I think we got most of it. It should be fine once it is properly cleaned.
Marlowe was too drunk to notice the missing chain. He stumbled back toward the party, still cursing, while Elijah and Clara exchanged a brief, triumphant glance. They had the key. Elijah waited 10 minutes, making sure Marlowe was thoroughly distracted by his guests, then slipped back to the study. The key worked perfectly in the cabinet lock. Inside, he found exactly what he was looking for, a leather-bound ledger containing detailed records of every slave on the plantation. Names, ages, physical descriptions, skills, prices paid, punishments administered, everything a slave catcher would need to pursue them. He also found something unexpected, a loaded pistol and a small bag of coins, probably kept for emergencies. Elijah took both, the gun because he might need it, the money because they would definitely need it, and then turned his attention to the ledger. He could not simply steal it. Its absence would be noticed immediately. But he could destroy its usefulness. He found Marlowe's ink pot and pen, and over the next 5 minutes, he systematically altered every entry. He changed names, mixed up ages, scrambled physical descriptions. When he was done, the ledger was worthless, a document so corrupted that no one could use it to identify specific slaves. But he was not finished. He took several pages from the ledger, specifically the pages listing him and his mother, and the 5 people who were escaping with them, and folded them into his pocket. Then he carefully returned everything else to the cabinet, locked it, and wiped down any surfaces he might have touched. As he left the study, he checked his internal clock. It was 10:15 p.m. According to the plan, Samuel should now be at the stables releasing the horses. Hannah should have confirmed that the dogs were asleep. Moses should be coordinating the gathering of supplies in the quarters. Everything was proceeding on schedule. Elijah returned to the party, played his role for another 30 minutes to establish that he had not been gone for any significant length of time, then quietly slipped out through the kitchen as the clock struck 11 p.m. The party was still going strong, the guests now so drunk they barely registered his departure. He made his way quickly to the quarters, moving through shadows, avoiding the patrol route he had memorized. When he reached his cabin, he found Moses, Samuel, and Abigail already there, along with his mother and the others. They had gathered everything they could carry: food, water, blankets, a few tools. They were ready.
The dogs?
Elijah asked quietly.
Sleeping like babies,
Anna confirmed.
They will not wake up for hours. The horses?
Samuel grinned.
Scattered across 3 fields. They will be chasing them down for days. The patrol just passed 5 minutes ago,
Moses said.
We have 25 minutes before they circle back.
Elijah nodded.
Then we go now. Stay close, stay quiet, and follow my lead.
They moved as a group through the darkness, 8 people bound together by desperate hope and shared risk. Elijah led them not toward the main road, too obvious, too easily blocked, but toward the forest that bordered the plantation's eastern edge. He knew these woods, had scouted them during his nocturnal reconnaissance, had identified a route that would take them to a creek they could follow north, using the water to mask their scent. Behind them, Oakage Plantation glowed with light and echoed with laughter, oblivious to what had just happened. Richard Marlowe was still drinking with his guests, still bragging about his success, still completely unaware that his giant slave had just executed a plan that would destroy everything he had built. They reached the tree line without incident. Elijah paused, looking back one final time at the place that had held his mother captive for 3 years, the place that represented everything evil about the system of slavery. Then he turned north and led his small band of fugitives into the darkness. They traveled through the night, following the creek as planned, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Oakage before the alarm was raised. Elijah set a brutal pace. He knew that every mile they covered tonight could mean the difference between freedom and recapture. The others struggled to keep up, especially Ruth and Abigail, both older and weakened by years of hard labor. But they pushed through exhaustion and fear, driven by the knowledge that there was no going back. By dawn, they had covered nearly 15 miles. Elijah found a dense thicket near a ravine and ordered everyone to rest. They were exhausted, their feet bleeding, their bodies pushed past normal limits. But they were also farther from Oakage than any of them had imagined possible.
"How long before they realize we are gone?"
Clara asked, her voice hoarse from exertion.
"The party will probably continue until 2 or 3 in the morning,"
Elijah estimated.
"They will not check the quarters until dawn at the earliest. That gives us maybe 6 or 7 hours before the alarm is raised. By the time they organize a search party, we will have a full day's head start. And the horses being scattered will slow them down,"
Samuel added.
"The dogs being drugged will slow them even more,"
Anna said. Ruth looked at her son with an expression of wonder.
"You really did it. You planned all of this, infiltrated the plantation, gathered allies, executed an escape that everyone said was impossible. How?"
Elijah was quiet for a moment before responding.
"You taught me to never accept injustice. Papa taught me to think like a hunter. The rest, I figured out along the way."
He looked around at the group, 8 people who had risked everything for freedom.
"But I could not have done it alone. Every one of you is essential. Every one of you is the reason we are sitting here right now instead of still being enslaved. So what happens now?"
Moses asked.
"Now we keep moving,"
Elijah said.
"We travel by night, hide by day. We head north toward Tennessee, then Kentucky, then Ohio. There are people along the way who will help, safe houses, conductors on the Underground Railroad. It will not be easy. Some of us might not make it, but we have a real chance."
They rested through the hot Georgia day, taking turns keeping watch. As the sun climbed higher, Elijah allowed himself to think about what he had accomplished. He had infiltrated a plantation, endured weeks of slavery, built a network of allies, gathered intelligence, and executed a plan that freed 8 people, including his mother. But more than that, he had proven something important, that enslaved people were not helpless, not powerless, not doomed to accept their bondage. With intelligence, courage, and careful planning, they could fight back. As evening approached and they prepared to resume their journey, Elijah took a moment alone with his mother.
"I am sorry it took so long to find you,"
he said quietly. Ruth shook her head, tears streaming down her face.
"You came. That is what matters. You risked everything to come for me. What mother could ask for more?"
They held each other for a long moment, and Elijah felt the weight of the past 3 years lifting slightly. She was not free yet. None of them were, not until they crossed into free territory. But they were no longer slaves. They were fugitives, yes, but fugitives who had chosen their own path, who had struck back against their oppressors, who had proven that the system of slavery was not as invincible as it pretended to be. As darkness fell, the group began walking again, heading north by the light of the stars. Behind them, they knew Oakage Plantation had erupted into chaos. The discovery of their escape would have triggered a massive manhunt. Riders would have been sent to neighboring plantations, to sheriffs, to slave catchers. Rewards would be posted. Dogs would be unleashed, though the drugged bloodhounds would be useless for hours yet. But Elijah had planned for all of this. The scattered horses would delay mounted pursuit. The corrupted ledger would make accurate descriptions difficult. The head start they had gained would be nearly impossible to overcome. And the route he had chosen, following waterways, avoiding roads, moving through terrain that was difficult for large groups to search, would make them very hard to track. 3 days later, they crossed into Tennessee. 6 days after that, they reached the first safe house, a small farm owned by Quakers who asked no questions and provided food, rest, and directions to the next station on the Underground Railroad. 12 days after leaving Oakage, they crossed into Kentucky. And 23 days after their escape, on a cold October morning, 8 former slaves crossed the Ohio River into free territory. They had made it. Against impossible odds, with nothing but courage and careful planning. They had achieved what the system of slavery insisted was impossible. They were free. Years later, when Elijah was an old man living in Canada, he would tell the story of his infiltration of Oakage Plantation to his grandchildren. He would describe how he had pretended to be weak, how he had endured weeks of slavery, how he had systematically dismantled the security of a plantation and led 8 people to freedom. His grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, barely able to believe that their gentle grandfather had once been the most dangerous slave a plantation owner ever bought. But the part of the story that Elijah always emphasized, the lesson he most wanted them to understand, was this. The people who enslaved others wanted the enslaved to believe they were powerless. They wanted them to accept their bondage as natural, inevitable, God-ordained. But it was all a lie. The enslaved had power, the power of intelligence, of courage, of community, of resistance. And when they chose to use that power, when they refused to accept injustice, extraordinary things became possible. Richard Marlowe never recovered from the escape. The loss of 8 slaves was financially damaging, but the blow to his reputation was worse. Other plantation owners whispered about his incompetence, about how he had been outsmarted by a slave he thought was simple and weak. The story spread, became legend. The tale of the giant, who was not what he seemed, who infiltrated a plantation and freed his mother and 7 others. It became a source of hope for enslaved people across the South, a reminder that resistance was possible, that freedom could be won. Catherine Marlowe, for her part, never forgave herself for not trusting her instincts. She had known there was something different about Jonas, something dangerous beneath the surface. But she had not acted on that knowledge, and it had cost them dearly. She lived the rest of her life with the knowledge that she had seen the truth and ignored it. As for Elijah, he lived to see the end of slavery, lived to see the Civil War and emancipation and the slow, painful reconstruction of a nation that had been built on bondage. He raised children and grandchildren in freedom, taught them to read and write, gave them opportunities he had had to fight for. And he never forgot the 8 people who had trusted him enough to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Because that night, when they walked away from Oakage Plantation and headed north toward freedom, they had done more than escape. They had proven that they were not property, not objects to be owned and controlled. They were human beings with agency and courage, and the fundamental right to determine their own destiny. And no one, not Richard Marlowe, not the slave catchers, not the entire system of slavery itself, could ever take that away from them. They had chosen freedom. And that choice, that single act of defiance in the face of overwhelming oppression, was worth more than all the plantations in the South.